Switzerland now requires all government software to be open source. Sorry, my face is covering the word open there. You can read. It's a cool thing. I'm actually quite excited about this. The idea that things that are funded by public money should be public, something I generally agree with. And I'm actually pretty excited to see where we end up with this. So let's take a read, see what they're doing, and get an idea of how Switzerland is changing the way that they build software for the government. The US remains reluctant to work with open source, but European countries are bolder. This has been sad. There have been a very small number of US open source projects from the government. Yeah, a lot of the typography stuff the US government did is all open source. They have like the US web design system shit that is fully open source. The license is a bit weird because it's government, but it is open source, and I believe they're relatively chill. I haven't fully read it or know what the license is based on, but a few parts of the project are not in the public domain. So they specify certain things that aren't, but otherwise the files licensed under the MIT, everything in the library and other additional stuff. So it's cool that they called all that out. This is a set of fonts and other resources for doing UI design from the US government that's open source. And I think this is awesome. I would love for the government to do more stuff like this. If they're spending tax money to build things, those things they build should benefit the general public in the US. Oh yeah, the BBC also has a bunch of cool open source. BBC has an open source, or their GitHub's open source code use on their public facing services, including like really helpful screenshot comparison tools, actual ways to render responsive images that are sane, especially back in the day when that was way harder. All of these things are useful resources that government money was used to create. I like the idea that they also decide to share it alongside. Simmergraph, the BBC's open source web application. Oh shit, yeah, the Thai website. I forgot that this whole site is open source, which is dope. That's so cool. If you're looking for like a big, complex web repo that you can learn for reference, here you go. It's open source. The point I'm making here is there are efforts to open source things in governments, but the idea of all government software being open sourced is a new thing that I'm excited to read a bit more about. Several European countries are betting on open source software. In the United States, not so much. In the latest news from across the Atlantic, Switzerland has taken a major step forward with its federal law on the use of electronic means for the fulfillment of government tasks. Again, if the government's using software that they paid to have written, sounds like it's going to be open source now. This groundbreaking legislation mandates using open source software in the public sector. Interesting. So this is anything that they choose to use as well. So if they have a service they're paying for, they have to use the open source alternative. Also, Germany ditched Microsoft for Linux and LibreOffice. Very interesting to not use Google Drive, but I can respect it. This new law requires all public bodies to disclose the source code for software developed by or for them, unless third-party rights or security concerns prevent it. This public money, public code approach aims to enhance government's operations, transparency, security, and efficiency. It's not super clear yet if this means you literally can't use closed source software that you're paying for or not. I'm curious to see how that develops. Making this move wasn't easy. It began in 2011 when the Swiss Federal Supreme Court published its court application, Open Justita, under an open source license. Interesting. Open Justita currently includes various modules for managing court decisions and other documents, as well as enriching and completing them with additional metadata. That's actually cool, an open source system for managing court documents. That's a cool thing that only a government would make. I see as open source. I'm curious if other governments actually use it. The proprietary legal software company Weblaw wasn't happy about this, though. Makes sense. If they're charging money for their service and the government just open source an alternative, doesn't surprise me. There were heated political and legal fights for more than a decade. Finally, the EMBAG was passed in 2023. Now the law not only allows the release of open source software by the Swiss government or its contractors, but it also requires the code be released under an open source license, unless the rights of third parties or security-related reasons would exclude or restrict this. It is my understanding from reading this thus far that it is software being commissioned to be created by the Swiss government that falls under these laws. So if they were asking Weblaw to make a new product for them, that would have to be open sourced. Professor Dr. Matias Stromer, hopefully I got that right, head of the Institute of Public Sector Transformation at the Bern University of Applied Sciences, led the fight for this law. He hailed it as a great opportunity for government, the IT industry, and society. Stromer believes everyone will benefit from this regulation, as it reduces vendor lock-in for the public sector, allows companies to expand their digital business solutions, and potentially leads to reduced IT costs and improved services for the taxpayers. There's actually an interesting point here where there's a lot of vendor lock-in in the government, because once they've made a commitment to a given solution, they're often pretty locked in just by the nature of like how much data and how much money it costs to move off. Like if your organization in the government has a budget and it costs more than that budget to move to a different solution, you're stuck indefinitely. But if your software is open source and you can theoretically move and host wherever, this makes pricing for government services significantly more competitive. I hadn't even thought of that angle before. It's interesting they called that out. In addition to mandating open source software, the EMBAG also requires the release of non-personal and non-security sensitive government data as open government data. This dual open by default approach marks a significant paradigm shift towards greater openness and practical reuse of software and data. Implementing the EMBAG is expected to serve as a model for other countries considering similar measures. It aims to promote digital sovereignty and encourage innovation and collaboration within the public sector. I was a little skeptical going in. I'm liking this more and more in the angles that they're going at with it. The Swiss Federal Statistics Office is leading the law's implementation, but the organizational and financial aspects of the OSS releases still need to be clarified. Other companies in Europe have long supported open source. For example, in 2023, the French President Macron stated that we love open source. He also loves one of my favorite artists ever, DJ Mehdi, because they played Signatune at the Olympic opening, which broke my heart. Mehdi passed away tragically over 10 years ago now. I was in fucking high school, so way longer. And hearing his song played at the Olympics was emotional. Respect for Macron for having similar taste in music and open source. I'm never going to say that right. Thank the FBI if you're American. Thank you. They use Linux on their PCs. That's actually kind of cool. The European Union has long worked on securing open source software via the EU's free and open source software auditing project. FOSSA. Look at that. Where are you, Aiden? FOSSA bot. Chat beat me to it. FOSSA mentioned. Also, this article looks interesting. What's the theory for why people don't use desktop Linux? This might be a free video in the future. Let me know in the comments if you think that's worth doing a video on. Anyways, that said, it's not all wine and roses in the EU. There's some worry that the European Commission will cut funding for the NGI Zero Commons Fund, an important funding source for open source projects. If all funded projects are open source, it's a different angle. We don't need a fund for just open source stuff if all things the government pays for have to be open source. I would be okay, as weird as it sounds to say, I'd be okay with killing this open source program. I am, if everything has to be open source now and all funding is now for open source. In the US, there's some support for open source, but not nearly as much as in Europe. The federal source code policy, for instance, requires federal agencies to release at least 20% of new custom developed code as open source software. However, it doesn't mandate the use of open source. I didn't know about this 20% rule. That's actually kind of cool. Is there more info on this? Found it here. Publishing all new code as open source allows the GSA to exceed the OMB's goal that 20% of code be published as open source. Interesting that that's like a formally stated goal. They also have code.json. Interesting. This is all of their releases. Very interesting. All Rails. Didn't know the government used so much Rails. Hurts. Good to know, though. Fascinating stuff. Final comment in the article is that Switzerland is well positioned, but we need to see Europe and the US move. No mention to the UK. Sorry to y'all. Regardless, I actually quite like this. I personally really like the idea of government money being spent in a way that benefits the population of that place the most. And the source code could be very beneficial to lots of people, be it software developers working independently, businesses that already exist, users with specific accessibility needs. All of these types of things are easier if there's good open source references. And I really like the idea of getting more big open source projects. As many great open source things as there aren't many examples of big open source applications, like actual services like Twitter that you use. Most of those tend to be closed source. They might open source some libraries, but you can't see how the whole thing works. And that's a really unique opportunity here, is that these government projects can be good examples of gigantic software projects that are maintained well, built well, and most importantly, open source so we can look at it and reference it. There's a lot to think about here. Hopefully I covered enough of it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And until next time, peace nerds.